Welcome to this journey through one of the most meticulously concealed tragedies in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about community, silence, and the price of loyalty in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that remained buried for half a century, hidden beneath the floorboards of a forgotten Appalachian settlement, where an entire community chose collective amnesia over truth and left a legacy so disturbing that even today, descendants refuse to speak certain names aloud. It was the year 1947. Across America, soldiers were returning home from World War II, bringing with them stories of overseas horrors that would haunt them for decades. The nation was entering a new era of prosperity and progress, building suburbs and highways, embracing modernity with both arms wide open. Television was beginning to flicker in living rooms. The future seemed bright, inevitable, unstoppable. But in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where Blackstone Hollow carved its deep scar into the earth, time moved differently. There, between mist-covered peaks and deep valleys where the sun barely penetrated even at noon, communities lived virtually isolated from the rest of the world, connected only by dirt trails that became impassable rivers of mud during the endless months of rain. The war had touched these places lightly, if at all. Some men had left and never returned. Others came back changed, carrying wounds both visible and invisible. But the rhythms of life in the hollow continued as they had for generations. Coal dust settled over everything like a second skin. The mines ran deep, deeper than anyone from the outside could imagine, tunneling into the mountain's heart with passages that sometimes broke through into natural cave systems that had existed since before humans walked the earth. The company owned everything: the houses, the store, the very air the miners breathed underground. Debt was inherited like family names. Escape was a fantasy children whispered about before learning to stop dreaming entirely. Blackstone Hollow itself was more a state of being than a place you could find on any map. The settlement consisted of roughly 40 families, maybe 200 souls in total, clustered along a creek that ran black with coal runoff even in the driest summers. The houses were identical company structures: weathered wood, tin roofs that sang in the rain, porches that sagged under the weight of too many years. Each dwelling leaned slightly toward the creek, as if the whole hollow was slowly sliding downward into some subterranean mouth waiting to swallow it whole. At the far end of the settlement, where the hollow narrowed to almost nothing, and the mountains pressed in from both sides like cupped hands, stood the Garrison house. This is where our story truly begins. The Garrison family had lived in Blackstone Hollow for 3 generations. Jonas Garrison, the patriarch in 1947, was a man in his early 60s whose body bore the brutal arithmetic of 35 years underground. His spine curved slightly forward, permanently bent by thousands of hours crouched in spaces too low for a man to stand. His hands were scarred testaments to rockfalls, equipment failures, and the 1,000 small violences that mining visited upon the human body. His lungs rattled with each breath, filled with coal dust that would eventually kill him, though not for many years yet. But Jonas was also something else. In a community where the company controlled every material aspect of existence, Jonas held a different kind of power. He was the Hollow's keeper of grievances, its unofficial judge, its memory. When disputes arose between families, and they arose constantly in places where poverty and proximity bred resentment like mold, Jonas was the one who decided outcomes. Not through any official authority, but through the accumulated weight of years and the respect that came from surviving longer than most in a profession designed to kill you young. His wife, Martha, had died in 1943, giving birth to their 8th child. The baby died too. This was not uncommon. Women in the hollow died of childbirth, of exhaustion, of despair disguised as pneumonia. They died in their 30s looking 60, used up by the demands of keeping families fed on company script that was always somehow insufficient. After Martha's death, Jonas's remaining children took on her responsibilities. The oldest daughter, Elizabeth, was 17 when her mother died. By 1947, she was 21 and had transformed into something harder than coal, more cutting than diamond. She ran the Garrison household with rigid efficiency, raising her younger siblings, Thomas, 16, Samuel, 14, Rachel, 11, and the twins, Mary and Margaret, 9, while also managing her father's needs and maintaining their standing in the community. Elizabeth's face had forgotten how to form certain expressions. Smiles were rare and never reached her eyes, which were the color of slate and just as reflective. She moved through the world with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that any misstep could trigger catastrophe. Her hands were always moving, cooking, cleaning, mending, tending, never still, as if stillness might allow unwanted thoughts to surface. The other families in Blackstone Hollow watched the Garrisons with a mixture of respect and wariness. There were the Harpers, whose 3 sons all worked in the mines alongside Jonas. There were the Callaways, a sprawling clan of 14 that seemed to produce a new baby every year, despite conditions that should have made fertility impossible. There were the Pritchards, the Bishops, the Wades, the Simmons, families whose names were etched into the Hollow's brief history through birth records, death records, and the endless ledger of debt at the company store. And then there were the Blackwoods. The Blackwood family lived in the house closest to the Garrisons, separated by perhaps 50 feet in a tangle of wild blackberry bushes that bloomed white in spring and produced fruit so dark it looked poisonous. The Blackwoods had arrived in the Hollow only 2 years before. In 1945, when the war ended and men were desperate for any work, even the kind that killed you by inches, Daniel Blackwood was different from the other miners. He'd seen the world beyond these mountains, had fought in France, witnessed things that carved away parts of his humanity he would never recover. He drank heavily, which was not unusual, but his drinking had a purpose beyond simple oblivion. He was trying to drown something that refused to die. His wife, Catherine, was a ghost in her own life. Thin to the point of translucence, she moved through her days with the mechanical precision of someone performing tasks she no longer remembered choosing. Her eyes were always focused on something slightly to the left of reality, as if she existed partially in another dimension where the rules were different and perhaps kinder. They had 1 child, a daughter named Sarah. Sarah Blackwood was 7 years old in 1947, and even in a community that had learned to overlook suffering as a matter of survival, there was something about Sarah that made people uncomfortable. She was too quiet, too still, too watchful. She had the kind of face that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, features that you struggled to remember even minutes after looking directly at her. She never played with the other children. This detail would become important later, very important. But in the spring of 1947, as the Hollow emerged from another brutal winter, as the creek began to run faster with snowmelt from the peaks above, as the mines reopened passages that had been closed since November, in that particular moment, Sarah Blackwood was simply another child in a place where childhood was a luxury few could afford. The Hollow had no school. Education happened sporadically when traveling teachers made the dangerous journey up the mountain, or when families could spare children from work long enough to teach them basic literacy. Most learning was practical: how to stretch a pound of flour into 3 days of meals, how to treat black lung symptoms with herbs gathered from the forest, how to recognize the subtle shifts in rock formation that preceded a cave-in. Sarah Blackwood never attended these informal lessons. According to later testimony, Catherine Blackwood kept her daughter close always, never letting her wander more than a few feet from the house. When asked why, Catherine would respond with vague statements about Sarah's delicate constitution or special needs. The other women in the Hollow assumed this meant the child was simple-minded or sickly, and out of respect, or perhaps indifference, they didn't press further. But Elizabeth Garrison noticed. Elizabeth noticed everything. Spring in Blackstone. Hollow was less a season than a confession. The snow retreated reluctantly, leaving behind mud so deep it could swallow a dog whole. The trees that clung to the mountainsides, twisted oaks and laurels that grew at impossible angles, produced leaves slowly, as if they too were exhausted by the effort of surviving another year. Wildflowers appeared in brief defiant bursts of color, trillium and bloodroot and violets, but they never lasted long. Something about the soil here, poisoned by decades of coal runoff, seemed to sicken even the hardiest blooms. The creek, which gave the settlement its water and its commerce and its only reliable connection to the outside world, ran highest in April. It transformed from its usual sluggish black crawl into something more aggressive, more alive. The sound of it, a constant rushing that echoed between the narrow walls of the Hollow, filled every silence, invaded every thought, became the soundtrack to which life was lived. At night, that sound could drive a person mad if they let it. The mines reopened on April 7, 1947. This was always a significant event, marked by no ceremony but carrying immense weight nonetheless. Winter closures meant no work, which meant no scrip, which meant families living on whatever they'd managed to save or scavenge during the previous season. By April, every family in Blackstone Hollow was behind on their debts to the company. The ledger at the store, a massive bound book kept by Mr. Hendricks, the company agent, was filled with negative numbers that grew like tumors, metastasizing through generations. Jonas Garrison was among the first men down on opening day. He descended the main shaft at dawn, when the air was still sharp with lingering winter cold and the stars hadn't yet yielded to the sun. The elevator cage, more rust than metal, swaying slightly as it plunged into darkness, carried 12 men on that first trip. They stood pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, breathing each other's air, each man alone with his thoughts about what might have changed during the months the mine sat dormant. Water seepage, gas pockets, collapsed supports, shifted rock formations, 100 different ways to die underground. And winter gave each one time to ripen. The descent took 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, the temperature rose 15 degrees and the air quality transformed from crisp morning freshness to the thick, dusty atmosphere of a place that had never known sunlight. By the time the cage shuddered to a stop at the main level, 200 feet below the surface, Jonas's lungs had already begun to protest, that familiar tightness creeping into his chest like an unwelcome friend. The main tunnel extended in both directions, reinforced by wooden beams that groaned under the weight of the mountain above. Electric lights strung along the ceiling provided sickly yellow illumination that threw shadows in wrong directions, making distances difficult to judge, and spaces feel simultaneously cramped and vast. Jonas had been working Section 7 for the past 3 years, a relatively productive vein that ran east from the main tunnel for roughly 800 feet before branching into smaller passages. He knew every inch of it, could navigate in complete darkness if necessary, understood its moods and warnings the way some men understood their wives. But on that first day back, something was different. The air in Section 7 tasted wrong. This is not something Jonas could have articulated to anyone who hadn't spent decades underground. Air underground has flavor, metallic when there's water nearby, sweet when gas is present, sharp when the rock is crumbling and releasing dust. Section 7 had always tasted neutral, almost clean despite the coal dust. But on April 7th, it tasted of decay, organic decay. Jonas mentioned this to Ray Harper, who was working the adjacent passage. Ray was younger, only 42, but reliable, methodical, not prone to panic or superstition. Ray sniffed the air carefully, his headlamp beam cutting through the darkness as he turned his head this way and that, as if the smell had direction. Could be a dead animal, Ray suggested. Maybe something crawled into a side tunnel during the winter and didn't crawl back out. This was possible. The mine had breached natural cave systems in multiple places, and those caves connected to the outside world through fissures and passages that sometimes allowed wildlife access. They'd found dead raccoons before, opossums, once even a black bear cub that had somehow gotten lost in the labyrinth and starved. But the smell in Section 7 wasn't quite right for animal decay. It was more complex than that. Layered, Jonas couldn't explain this either. This sense that the smell had components, that it was telling a story his conscious mind couldn't quite decode. He filed the observation away and went to work, because the mind didn't care about your discomfort or your intuition. The mind cared only that you brought coal to the surface, filled your quota, earned your scrip, stayed alive long enough to do it again tomorrow. By midday, 6 tons of coal had been extracted from Section 7. By week's end, Jonas had pushed the smell to the back of his consciousness, filed it under the thousands of other underground sensations that were unusual, but not immediately threatening. Above ground, life in the hollow settled into its familiar patterns. The women woke before dawn to start fires, prepare breakfast, pack lunches for the miners. The children who were old enough worked alongside their mothers, hauling water from the creek, tending small vegetable gardens that struggled in the poisoned soil, mending clothes that had been mended so many times they were more patch than original fabric. Elizabeth Garrison maintained her household with the precision of a military operation. Breakfast at 5. Thomas and Samuel off to the mine with their father at 5:30. Rachel responsible for feeding the chickens and collecting eggs. The twins, Mary and Margaret, tasked with sweeping and dusting, though they were still young enough that their help was more performance than productivity. Elizabeth herself worked from before sunrise until well after dark, cooking, cleaning, managing the family's meager finances, visiting other households to provide what comfort she could when tragedy struck. And tragedy struck regularly. A man crushed in a rockfall, a child dead from scarlet fever, a woman's mind broken by the relentless grind of poverty and loss. Through it all, Elizabeth maintained a facade of composure, so complete that people had begun to wonder if she felt anything at all anymore. But she did feel, constantly, overwhelmingly. She simply couldn't afford to show it. On April 19th, 12 days after the mine reopened, Elizabeth noticed something that would later be identified as the first concrete piece of evidence in what would become known as the Blackstone Hollow case. She was hanging laundry, sheets, and work clothes heavy with moisture from the wash tub when she heard crying coming from the direction of the Blackwood house. Not loud crying, not the dramatic wailing of a child seeking attention, but rather a muffled, hopeless sobbing that spoke of someone who had given up on being heard. Elizabeth's first instinct was to ignore it. Other families' business was their own, and in a community where privacy was already nearly impossible, maintaining even the fiction of boundaries was important for survival. But the crying continued for 10 minutes, 15, 20. Finally, Elizabeth set down the wet shirt she'd been wringing out and walked the 50 feet to the Blackwood house, stepping carefully through the mud and the wild blackberry bushes that tore at her dress like reaching hands. The Blackwood house looked like all the others. Same weathered wood, same tin roof, same sagging porch, but it had an air of abandonment about it despite being clearly occupied. The curtains were always drawn. No smoke ever rose from the chimney except late at night. The small garden plot that every family maintained was overgrown with weeds. Elizabeth knocked on the door. The crying stopped immediately. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, approached from inside. The door opened a crack. Catherine Blackwood's face appeared in the gap, half-shadowed, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Yes?" Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard crying," Elizabeth said simply. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything's fine." The response was automatic, practiced. Sarah was just upset about something. Children, you know. Elizabeth did know. She'd raised 6 siblings. She understood the full spectrum of children's emotional displays. What she'd heard from the Blackwood house wasn't the normal frustration or disappointment of childhood. It was something darker. "If you need any help," Elizabeth began. "We're fine." Catherine started to close the door, then paused. For just a moment her eyes focused, really focused, and met Elizabeth's. In that moment, Elizabeth saw something that made her blood turn cold, absolute terror. Then the door closed, the latch clicked, and Elizabeth was alone on the porch with the blackberry bushes and the sound of the creek rushing in the background. She stood there for several seconds, processing what she'd seen, trying to understand the message in Catherine Blackwood's eyes. Then she turned and walked back to her own house, back to her laundry, back to the endless tasks that filled every waking moment. But she didn't forget. Elizabeth Garrison never forgot anything. The Blackstone Hollow mining company maintained only minimal presence in the settlement itself. Mr. Hendricks, the company agent, managed the store and kept the ledgers. He was a thin man with spectacles and the permanent stoop of someone who spent his days bent over account books. He lived in a slightly larger house at the mouth of the hollow, where the dirt road began its descent from the ridge above. He was not well liked, but he was respected in the way that all people who controlled resources were respected, with fear masquerading as deference. The company also employed one security officer, a title that was generous for what amounted to an enforcer whose job was to ensure productivity and prevent theft. His name was William Fletcher, and he'd taken the position in 1946, after returning from the war with wounds that prevented him from working underground. Fletcher was 32 years old and carried himself with military bearing that set him apart from the Hollow's other residents. He walked with a slight limp, shrapnel in his left leg that ached in cold weather, but otherwise seemed remarkably intact compared to most veterans who'd seen combat. He lived alone in a small cabin halfway between the mine entrance and the settlement proper, a location that reinforced his role as intermediary between the company's interests and the workers' lives. Fletcher's responsibilities included investigating theft, settling disputes that threatened productivity, and generally maintaining order through whatever means necessary. He carried a pistol, a Colt .45, that had been his service weapon, and everyone in the Hollow knew he wouldn't hesitate to use it if circumstances demanded, but Fletcher was also observant in ways that went beyond his official duties. He noticed patterns, discrepancies, the small details that didn't quite align with the expected rhythms of Hollow life. In late April, Fletcher began to notice something unusual about the Blackwood family. Specifically, he noticed that Daniel Blackwood's behavior underground had become increasingly erratic. Daniel worked in Section 4, several hundred feet from Jonas Garrison's Section 7, but the miners all gathered in the same areas for lunch breaks and shift changes. Fletcher made a habit of being present during these gatherings, ostensibly to watch for theft, but actually to maintain awareness of the men's morale and state of mind. A man who was desperate or broken was a man who might do something that would require intervention. Daniel Blackwood was both desperate and broken. He'd always been troubled, the drinking, the 1,000-yard stare, the way he sometimes flinched at sounds that weren't there. But in late April, his symptoms intensified. He began talking to himself while working, long muttered conversations that made the other miners uncomfortable. He stopped eating during lunch breaks, just sat staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. On April 28th, Daniel didn't show up for his shift. This was notable because missing work meant no pay, which meant falling further behind on debts, which meant potential eviction from the Hollow entirely. No one missed work voluntarily. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore, and then you worked a few more days after that because the alternative was worse. Fletcher went to the Blackwood house that evening to investigate. He found Daniel sitting on the porch in the dark. No lantern, no fire, just sitting there staring at nothing. The man didn't acknowledge Fletcher's approach, didn't respond when Fletcher called his name, didn't move when Fletcher climbed the porch steps and stood directly in front of him. "Daniel," Fletcher said, keeping his voice level and authoritative, "you missed your shift." No response. "You understand that puts you in breach of your contract." "2 more missed shifts and the company can terminate your housing." Still no response. Fletcher studied the man more carefully. Daniel's eyes were open but glassy, his breathing shallow and rapid. His hands trembled slightly, fingers twitching in irregular patterns. This wasn't simple depression or exhaustion. This was something more acute. "Where's your wife?" Fletcher asked. For the first time, Daniel reacted. His eyes focused, found Fletcher's face, and in them Fletcher saw something that reminded him viscerally of men he'd known in France. Men who'd seen too much, survived things that should have killed them, and were now living in the space between sanity and its absence. "Inside," Daniel whispered. "Always inside. And your daughter?" Daniel's face contorted. The trembling in his hands intensified. For a moment, Fletcher thought the man might speak, might say something important. Then the door behind Daniel opened. Catherine Blackwood appeared in the doorway, backlit by a dim lantern inside. Her thin frame cast almost no shadow. "My husband is ill," she said, her voice carrying that same rehearsed quality Elizabeth had noticed days earlier. "He'll return to work tomorrow." "Mrs. Blackwood," Fletcher began, "if there are problems, there are no problems." Catherine's interruption was sharp, almost aggressive, completely at odds with her usual ghostly demeanor. "We're managing our family affairs. Daniel will work tomorrow." "Good evening, Mr. Fletcher." She stepped forward, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and the man rose like a puppet on strings, all mechanical movement with no will behind it. Catherine guided him inside, and the door closed, leaving Fletcher alone on the porch in the darkness. He stood there for several minutes, listening. From inside the house came muffled voices, Catherine speaking in low, urgent tones. Daniel's responses too quiet to make out, and underneath it all so faint Fletcher almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. The sound of a child crying. Fletcher didn't report the incident to Hendricks. This was a decision he would later struggle to explain, even to himself. His job was to report anything that might affect productivity or indicate larger problems in the Hollow. Daniel Blackwood's breakdown absolutely qualified, but something stayed Fletcher's hand. Perhaps it was the war. Perhaps it was having seen too many men destroyed by things beyond their control and then punished for being destroyed. Perhaps it was simply that Fletcher recognized Daniel's condition as something that couldn't be fixed by company intervention, only made worse. Or perhaps it was that final sound, that child crying, and Fletcher's unwillingness to open whatever door that sound came from. He walked back to his cabin and poured himself a drink, the first of many that night. By the next morning, Daniel Blackwood was back at work. He appeared at the mine entrance before dawn, took his place in the elevator cage, descended into the darkness without a word to anyone. According to the men who worked near him, he performed his duties adequately that day. Not well, but adequately. He loaded coal, operated equipment, followed safety protocols, but he never stopped muttering. Ray Harper, whose section adjoined Daniel's, later told Fletcher that the muttering had a rhythmic quality to it, almost like a chant or prayer. Ray couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Daniel Blackwood was begging. Begging for what? Ray couldn't say. The Hollow moved through May with the usual mixture of hardship and endurance. A rock fall in Section 3 injured 2 men, neither seriously enough to justify time off work. One of the Calloway children died of diphtheria, despite the traveling doctor's best efforts. The spring rains continued, turning the Hollow into a river of mud that made every movement exhausting, and gradually, quietly, word began to spread about strange sounds coming from the Blackwood house, not the crying that Elizabeth had heard. Something else. Scraping. Late at night, after all the lamps in the Hollow had been extinguished and even the miners working night shifts were deep underground, the Blackwood house would emit sounds of something being dragged across the floor. Heavy furniture moved, objects scraped along wood, the kinds of sounds that suggested major rearrangement of interior space. The Harper house was close enough to hear it clearly. Mary Harper, Ray's wife, mentioned it to several other women during a gathering at the creek where they washed clothes together. "I hear it most nights now," Mary said, her hands working a shirt against the washing stone. "Starts around midnight, goes on for hours sometimes. Makes my skin crawl." "Maybe they're building something," suggested another woman. "Or cleaning. At midnight?" Mary shook her head. "It's not normal. None of it's normal with that family." This is when Elizabeth Garrison shared what she'd witnessed. The crying, Catherine's frightened eyes, the general wrongness that emanated from the Blackwood house like a physical force. The women discussed this in low voices, glancing occasionally toward the house in question, which sat silent and closed, as always, under the weak May sun. "Someone should check on the child," one woman finally said. "That little girl, Sarah. When's the last time anyone actually saw her?" The question hung in the air. The women looked at each other, each trying to remember. Sarah Blackwood had always been kept close, rarely seen, never allowed to play with other children. But surely they'd seen her recently. They couldn't remember. Not one of them could recall seeing Sarah Blackwood in weeks, maybe longer. Elizabeth Garrison made her decision on May 23rd. She would investigate the Blackwood house properly. Not a polite knock and brief conversation, but actual investigation. She would find out what was happening to Sarah Blackwood, because if no one else in the Hollow had the courage or moral clarity to act, then the responsibility fell to her. This is who Elizabeth was, someone who took responsibility because someone had to, because the alternative was complicity, and complicity was its own form of evil. She chose midday for her approach, when Daniel would be underground and Catherine would presumably be engaged in household tasks. She brought bread as an excuse, a loaf fresh from the morning's baking. Ostensibly a neighborly gesture, but actually a prop to justify the visit. The walk from her house to the Blackwood house took less than a minute, but felt much longer. The space between the houses was filled with those blackberry bushes, now heavy with unripe berries that looked like clusters of small green tumors. Birds avoided the area despite the promise of future fruit. The ground underneath was bare dirt, nothing growing, as if even weeds recognized this as cursed space. Elizabeth knocked firmly on the door. No response. She knocked again, harder. "Catherine?" "It's Elizabeth Garrison. I've brought bread. Still no response, but Elizabeth heard movement inside. Footsteps, but slow, dragging slightly. The kind of movement someone makes when they don't want to be heard, but can't help making noise. "Catherine, I know you're there." Elizabeth's voice carried the authority she'd developed, raising her siblings, the tone that said she would not be dismissed or ignored. "Open the door, please." More silence. Then finally, after what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, the latch clicked. The door opened a crack. Catherine Blackwood looked worse than Elizabeth remembered. Her face was gaunt to the point of skeletal, her eyes sunken and ringed with the purple-black of severe sleep deprivation. Her hair, which had been thin before, now came out in visible patches, revealing pale scalp beneath. "Elizabeth." Catherine's voice cracked on the name. "This isn't a good time. I won't stay long. I just wanted to bring this and check on Sarah. I haven't seen her in a while." At the mention of Sarah's name, Catherine's face did something complicated. A series of micro-expressions that flashed too quickly for Elizabeth to parse fully, but left an impression of guilt, fear, and something else. Something protective but twisted. "Sarah's sleeping. She's been unwell. I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps I could—" "No." The word came out sharp, almost panicked. "No, you can't come in. She's sleeping and I can't risk waking her. She needs rest." Elizabeth held Catherine's gaze, trying to communicate something beyond words. "I know something is wrong. I want to help. Please let me help." But Catherine's eyes had gone unfocused again, sliding away from direct contact. "Thank you for the bread." Catherine reached through the gap in the door and took the loaf, her fingers brushing Elizabeth's briefly. Her skin was cold despite the warm May air. "I need to go now." The door closed. Elizabeth stood on the porch, frustration and concern warring inside her. Every instinct told her that something terrible was happening inside that house. But what could she do? Force her way in? Demand access? On what authority? She turned to leave, and that's when she saw it. A window on the side of the house, one of the few that didn't have curtains fully drawn, showed a gap of perhaps 3 inches. Through that gap, Elizabeth could see into what appeared to be the main living area. The furniture had been moved, radically rearranged. The table and chairs that would normally occupy the center of the room had been pushed against one wall. The floor in the middle of the space was completely clear, and in that cleared space, visible even from Elizabeth's angle, were scratches in the wooden floorboards. Deep scratches. Recent scratches. The kind of scratches that might be made by something or someone being dragged repeatedly across the floor. Elizabeth went directly to William Fletcher. She found him at his cabin, reviewing supply requisitions or some other tedious administrative task. He looked up when she knocked. Surprised to see her, Elizabeth Garrison was not the kind of person who needed the security officer's attention under normal circumstances. "Miss Garrison." Fletcher set aside his papers and stood, his military training making him automatically respectful toward a woman in distress, though Elizabeth's face showed only determination. "What can I do for you?" The Blackwood family. Elizabeth didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Something's wrong there." "Seriously wrong? I think the child is in danger." Fletcher's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "What makes you think that?" Elizabeth laid out everything. The crying she'd heard, Catherine's terror-filled eyes, the scratches on the floor, the fact that no one had actually seen Sarah Blackwood in weeks. She presented the facts clearly, without embellishment, letting them speak for themselves. When she finished, Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. "I've had concerns about that family myself," he finally admitted. "Daniel missed work, came back. Different. But that's not evidence of anything criminal. People are allowed to be strange in their own homes. We're talking about a child's safety." "I understand. But I can't just break into someone's house based on suspicions. I need actual evidence of wrongdoing, or I need the company to order an investigation, and Hendricks won't do that without cause. So what are you saying? We do nothing?" Fletcher stood, paced to the window, looked out at the hollow spread below them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows from the mountains, turning half the settlement dark even though it was only 3 o'clock. "I'm saying I'll watch them more carefully. I'll find a reason to inspect the house, safety violation, something like that. Give me a few days to do this right by protocol, so that if there is something wrong, we can actually do something about it." Elizabeth wanted to argue, wanted to demand immediate action, But she also understood the realities of hierarchy and procedure. Fletcher wasn't wrong. Acting precipitously could make things worse, could give the Blackwoods warning, could doom any chance of helping Sarah if help was needed. A few days, Elizabeth agreed, but no longer. If you won't act after that, I will. Fletcher nodded, recognizing the steel in her voice. A few days. But days have a way of becoming weeks, and weeks have a way of hiding atrocities. That night, May 23, 1947, the Hollow experienced something unprecedented. A scream, not the crying that Elizabeth had heard, not the muttered prayers that Daniel whispered underground. This was something primal, a sound that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the ancient part of the brain that understood danger, that recognized the voice of suffering so profound it transcended language. It came from the Blackwood house at approximately 2 a.m. The scream woke nearly every resident of the Hollow, sharp enough to cut through the heavy sleep of exhaustion, piercing enough to carry over the constant rush of the creek. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds before being abruptly cut off, as if someone had clamped a hand over the screamer's mouth or the source had been otherwise silenced. Then silence. Absolute and somehow worse than the scream itself. Lights began appearing in windows throughout the Hollow. People emerged onto porches, lanterns in hand, looking toward the Blackwood house and then at each other, waiting for someone to take action, to investigate, to do something. Elizabeth Garrison was the first to move. She grabbed a lantern and walked directly toward the Blackwood house, her nightgown and robe doing nothing to protect her from the cold night air, but seeming almost regal in her determination. By the time she reached the Blackwood porch, a dozen others had followed. Ray Harper, Mary Harper, several of the Calloway men, and William Fletcher himself, still buttoning his shirt as he limped hurriedly down from his cabin. Elizabeth pounded on the door. "Catherine, Daniel, open this door right now." No response. Fletcher pushed forward, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Company security. Open the door, or I'm coming in." This wasn't strictly legal authority, but in places like Blackstone Hollow, the company's power superseded most legal niceties. Fletcher's word was law because the company said it was, and the company owned everything, including the ground they stood on. Still no response from inside. Fletcher tried the door handle. Locked. He took a step back, measured the distance, and kicked hard just below the lock. The door frame splintered. These company houses were built cheap and fast, and the door swung inward. What they saw inside would become the subject of testimony, official reports, and 50 years of whispered stories. The main room was exactly as Elizabeth had glimpsed it through the window. Furniture pushed to the walls, floor cleared in the center, but now they could see the full extent of the scratches in the wood. They formed patterns almost like writing, but not quite. Curved lines that intersected and doubled back on themselves in ways that made your eyes hurt to follow them. Catherine Blackwood stood in the center of that cleared space, perfectly still, perfectly silent. She was dressed in a nightgown that hung on her skeletal frame like a burial shroud. Her feet were bare and bleeding slightly, small cuts that suggested she'd been standing there for a long time, her weight shifting unconsciously, the rough wooden floor abrading her skin. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Daniel Blackwood sat in a chair against the far wall, his wrists bound to the armrests with strips of cloth. His head hung forward, chin against chest, and for a horrifying moment Fletcher thought he was dead. But then Daniel's shoulders moved, a slight rise and fall. Breathing, unconscious or asleep, but alive. And in the corner, barely visible in the shadows beyond the lantern light, was a shape covered by a blanket. The shape was small, child-sized. "Jesus Christ," Ray Harper whispered, giving voice to what they all felt. Fletcher moved first, his military training overriding the paralysis of shock. He crossed to Catherine, touched her shoulder gently. "Mrs. Blackwood?" No response. Her eyes didn't even flicker. He shook her slightly. "Catherine?" Nothing. She was utterly catatonic, locked in some internal space they couldn't reach. Mary Harper, braver or perhaps more maternal than the others, moved toward the covered shape in the corner. Elizabeth tried to stop her, some instinct warning against whatever revelation that blanket concealed, but Mary had already reached it, already begun to lift the fabric. She gasped and dropped the blanket immediately, stumbling backward. "What is it?" Fletcher demanded. Mary couldn't speak, could only shake her head, her hand over her mouth. Fletcher crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled the blanket fully away. Sarah Blackwood lay curled on the floor in a position that shouldn't have been possible for a living body. Her spine was bent backward at an angle that suggested either incredible flexibility or multiple fractures. Her arms were twisted behind her in a way that made Fletcher's own shoulders ache in sympathy. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, and her mouth was frozen in a rictus that could have been a scream, or a smile, or something that had no human equivalent. But she was breathing. Shallow, rapid breaths that came in small hitches and pauses, but breathing nonetheless. "Someone get the doctor," Fletcher said, his voice remarkably steady. "Now, run to the ridge, get Dr. Morrison, tell him it's an emergency." One of the Calloway men took off at a sprint. Fletcher knelt beside Sarah, trying to assess her condition without touching her, afraid that any contact might cause further injury or pain. Her skin was cold but not corpse cold. Her pulse, when he carefully checked her wrist, was rapid and thready but present. "Sarah?" He spoke softly, trying to reach whatever consciousness might still exist inside this broken vessel. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved, not toward him, not focusing on anything, but they moved. A slow tracking motion, as if following something invisible that traversed the ceiling. Then her mouth opened slightly and she spoke. One word, barely audible, slurred by whatever injury or constraint affected her jaw. "Mama." The word broke something in the room. Several of the witnesses began crying. Mary Harper sank to her knees. Ray gripped his wife's shoulder, his face a mask of controlled horror. Elizabeth, still standing near the door, felt a rage building inside her that was so intense it manifested as physical heat. Her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. Fletcher stood and turned to face Daniel Blackwood, who remained slumped in the chair, apparently oblivious to everything happening around him. "Wake him up," Fletcher said to Ray. Ray crossed to Daniel and slapped him hard across the face. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 3rd strike, Daniel's head jerked up, his eyes opening with the confused panic of someone waking from a nightmare into a worse reality. "What?" Daniel looked around, seeming to register the crowd in his house. The chaos, the blanket-covered shape, no, the exposed shape now, of his daughter on the floor. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God you found her. Thank God it's over. What did you do?" Fletcher's voice was cold, controlled, the voice of a man who'd interrogated enemy soldiers and knew how to strip away pretense. "What the hell did you do to your daughter?" "I didn't." Daniel's words came faster now, desperate. "It wasn't me. It was Catherine. I tried to stop her, tried to make her see reason, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was necessary. She said Sarah had to be prepared. Prepared for what? For him." Daniel's eyes took on a feverish quality. "For when he comes." Catherine said he was coming soon. Said Sarah had to be ready to receive him, had to be made into a proper vessel. "She's been doing the rituals for months. Every night He cut himself off, shaking his head violently as if trying to dislodge the memories. "She'd take Sarah down there," Daniel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Below, into the caves. There are passages under this house, did you know that? Natural caves that connect to the mine system. Catherine found them last summer. She'd take Sarah down there and do things. I don't know what exactly. She wouldn't let me watch, but I'd hear Sarah screaming. God, the screaming. Night after night, and I couldn't stop it. Why didn't you report this?" Fletcher demanded. "Why didn't you come to me or anyone else?" Daniel laughed, a bitter sound edged with hysteria. "Because I was afraid. Because Catherine said if I told anyone, he would come for me too. Said I'd already been marked just by knowing about it, that my only salvation was to help her complete the work. So I helped. God forgive me, I helped. By tying yourself to a chair, I couldn't watch anymore. Couldn't participate. Last few nights I've been drinking myself unconscious, but tonight I couldn't get enough liquor, so I begged Catherine to tie me up so I wouldn't interfere. She agreed, said it didn't matter anymore, that the work was almost complete. Fletcher looked at Catherine, still standing motionless in the center of the room. "What about her?" he asked. "Why is she like this?" "I don't know. She was fine an hour ago. Well, not fine, but functional. She was talking, moving around. Then Sarah screamed, and Catherine just stopped, like someone cut her strings. Dr. Morrison arrived 40 minutes later, huffing and red-faced from the rundown from the ridge. He was a capable physician by frontier standards, had seen his share of injuries and illnesses, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for Sarah Blackwood's condition. He examined her carefully, his hands gentle despite his obvious distress. When he finally stood and faced the assembled crowd, more people had arrived, drawn by the commotion. His expression was grim. "I can't move her," he said bluntly. "Multiple fractures, possibly some spinal damage. Moving her could cause permanent paralysis or death. She needs a hospital, specialists. Equipment I don't have. How long until we can transport her?" Fletcher asked. "Days at minimum. Maybe weeks. I'll need to splint what I can, but even then..." He trailed off, the implications clear. Sarah's chances of recovery were minimal, and her chances of surviving transport to a real hospital were even worse. "How did this happen?" the doctor asked. "What kind of accident?" "It wasn't an accident," Fletcher cut him off. "It was done to her, deliberately, over months." Morrison's face went pale. "That's not possible." "No one could survive. She did survive. She is surviving. Somehow." The doctor looked back at Sarah, his medical mind struggling to reconcile what he knew about human physiology with what he saw before him. "I'll need to stay with her. Monitor her condition. Someone should fetch my kit from my house and bring it here." Fletcher nodded to one of the Calloway men, who set off immediately. "What about Catherine?" Elizabeth spoke for the first time since entering the house, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Catatonia," Morrison said after examining her briefly. "Psychological break of some kind. She's not in any immediate physical danger, but she's not conscious either. Not in any meaningful sense. Can you bring her out of it?" "Maybe, with time. But I've never seen a case this severe." Fletcher made a decision. "We need to secure this scene and search the house. Ray, take Daniel outside and keep him under watch. Mary, can you sit with Sarah until the doctor's kit arrives?" Mary nodded, though her face showed her reluctance. "Elizabeth," Fletcher continued, "I need you to help me search the house. We need to find evidence of what happened here." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She wanted nothing more than to be away from this place, to wash her hands and eyes and mind of what she'd seen. But someone had to do this. Someone had to bear witness. The Blackwood house was small, just 2 rooms plus a root cellar. The main room they'd already seen. The bedroom was cramped, containing a single bed where Daniel and Catherine presumably slept, and a small pallet on the floor where Sarah must have slept before. The room was unnaturally clean. Not just tidy, but scrubbed. The wooden floor showed signs of recent washing. The walls had been wiped down, even the ceiling looked like it had been cleaned somehow. The air smelled of lye soap and something else, something sharp and chemical that Fletcher couldn't identify. "They were covering evidence," Elizabeth said, voicing what Fletcher was thinking. But covering what? What had happened in this room that required such thorough cleaning? Fletcher opened the small wardrobe that held the family's few clothes. Nothing unusual. He checked under the bed, finding only dust and a few loose boards. He was about to move to the root cellar when Elizabeth made a small sound. Not quite a gasp, more a sharp intake of breath. She was standing by Sarah's pallet, holding a bundle of cloth she'd found wedged between the thin mattress and the wall. Fletcher crossed to her. "What is it?" Elizabeth unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing a small book. Not a published book, but a handmade journal, pages stitched together with thread, bound in soft leather that looked like it might have once been part of a work glove. She opened it carefully. The pages were covered in handwriting, neat, careful script that filled every available space. The ink was various colors, suggesting different sources: pencil, pen, even what looked like blood in some sections. It was Sarah's diary, or at least it had started as Sarah's diary. The first entries were childish observations, the kind of thing a 6 or 7-year-old might write. "Today, Mama made bread. It was good. I helped." Simple sentences with simple spelling. But as the entries progressed, the writing changed. Became more sophisticated, more disturbing. Elizabeth read one entry aloud, her voice shaking slightly. "March 15th, 1947. Mama says I am special. Mama says I can hear things other people cannot hear. She took me into the dark place under the house today. It was very dark and very cold. She said I needed to learn to be comfortable in the dark, because that is where he lives. I do not like the dark place. I told Mama I wanted to go back upstairs, but she said I needed to stay. We stayed for 3 hours. My legs hurt from sitting. Mama said the pain is part of learning. Elizabeth flipped forward several pages, the entries becoming darker, more detailed, more explicit about what Catherine was doing to her daughter. April 3rd. Mama tied my hands today. She said I needed to learn stillness. I cried, but she said crying was resistance and resistance was sin. I stayed tied for 6 hours. April 12th. Mama says my body is wrong for receiving him. She says it needs to be made right. Today, she started teaching me the positions. It hurt very much. I screamed and Papa came, but Mama sent him away. She said Papa is weak and cannot understand the work. April 20th. I cannot write much today. My hands are broken. Mama says they will heal incorrectly, and that is good because incorrectness is what he requires. I do not understand. I am very scared. The last entry was dated May 22nd, the day before they found Sarah. I think I am dying. Mama says no, says I am transforming. She says tomorrow night he will come and I will receive him, and then everything will make sense. I hope she is right because I hurt so much. I cannot remember not hurting anymore. Sometimes I think maybe dying would be better, but Mama says I cannot die until he comes. I hope he comes soon. Elizabeth closed the diary, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. We need to find those caves, Fletcher said grimly. Whatever Catherine was doing, the evidence is down there. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen area. Fletcher had seen dozens of similar cellars in the hollow, small underground spaces used to store vegetables and preserved foods, keep things cool during summer. They were usually cramped, damp, and utterly ordinary. The Blackwood cellar was not ordinary. Fletcher descended the ladder first. Lantern held high, and found himself in a space that was larger than expected. The cellar had been expanded, dug out beyond the house's foundation, extending back into the hillside, and at the far end, barely visible in the lantern light, was an opening, a passage, natural rock formation, limestone carved by ancient water flows, creating a tunnel that led deeper into the earth. The opening was perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, requiring anyone entering to stoop or crawl. Fletcher called up to Elizabeth. "Get me another lantern and some rope." "I'm going in." "Not alone, you're not," Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. "Give me a minute." She appeared at the top of the ladder moments later, having changed from her nightgown into a work dress and practical boots. She carried a second lantern and a coil of rope. Together, they entered the passage. The stone walls were slick with moisture, covered in the kind of mineral deposits that formed over thousands of years. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, heading deeper into the mountain. The air was noticeably cooler than the cellar, and carried that particular smell of caves, earth and water and stone and time. After perhaps 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. This is what they found. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet in diameter. The ceiling was high enough to stand comfortably. Water dripped from stalactites, creating a constant background rhythm that echoed strangely in the enclosed space. But these natural features were not what drew the eye. The walls had been marked, extensively marked. Someone, Catherine, presumably, had spent countless hours drawing on the limestone walls. The drawings were done in various substances: charcoal, chalk, what looked like dried blood, even fingernail scratches deep enough to leave permanent grooves in the relatively soft stone. The images were not random. They depicted a figure, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in too many places. The head was either absent or so abstract as to be unrecognizable. In some drawings, the figure stood alone. In others, it was surrounded by smaller figures, clearly meant to be human, in various states of prostration or transformation. And in the center of the chamber, directly beneath the tallest stalactite, was a chair, not a crude mining chair or a piece of salvaged furniture. This was constructed specifically for this space, built from wood that looked old, not just aged, but ancient. The wood had a gray quality to it, like petrified wood that had turned to stone while maintaining its shape. The chair had restraints, leather straps attached to the arms and legs, darkened with old sweat and blood, and on the seat, barely visible but unmistakably present, were stains. Old stains layered upon older stains, creating a palimpsest of suffering. "This is where she brought Sarah," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "night after night. This is where she did it." Fletcher examined the chair more closely, careful not to touch it. Around the base were scattered objects, candle stubs burned down to nothing, pieces of cloth that might have been gags or blindfolds, small bones, animal bones, he told himself. Please let them be animal bones. There's more, Elizabeth said, pointing to another passage at the far end of the chamber. They followed it. This second passage was shorter, only 30 feet or so, and it opened into another chamber. This one was smaller, more claustrophobic, with a ceiling so low even Elizabeth had to duck her head. And here they found Catherine's altar. A flat rock served as the surface. On it were arranged various objects, candles, an old Bible with pages torn out and burned at the edges, a knife, small, wickedly sharp, with dried blood on the blade, several bottles containing liquids of unknown composition, and a large bowl made from what looked like hammered copper. The bowl contained ashes mixed with something else, something organic that had been burned. Fletcher felt his gorge rise. He'd seen battlefield injuries, had watched men die in various horrible ways, had thought himself hardened to human cruelty. But this calculated, ritualistic torture of a child, this was something else entirely. We need to document everything, he said, forcing his mind back into military analytical mode because the alternative was to give in to the rage and horror threatening to overwhelm him. We need evidence for trial. Trial. Elizabeth's voice was sharp. Catherine's catatonic and Daniel's claiming ignorance. Who exactly are we going to try? Daniel knew. He admitted it. He helped, even if indirectly. That's enough for criminal charges. And what about everyone else in this hollow? Elizabeth's anger was finding a target now, expanding beyond the Blackwoods to encompass the entire community. Everyone who heard Sarah crying and did nothing. Everyone who noticed something wrong but looked away. Are we going to try them too? Fletcher had no answer to that. They gathered what evidence they could, the diary, sketches of the chamber drawings, samples of the substances from Catherine's altar. They measured distances, noted layouts, created the kind of documentation that would hold up in court. When they finally emerged back through the root cellar, the sun was beginning to rise. They'd been underground for hours. The aftermath moved with the inexorable momentum of avalanche. Dr. Morrison worked tirelessly to stabilize Sarah, but her condition remained critical. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in fragments that made no sense. Words in languages no one recognized, descriptions of things that shouldn't exist, names for entities that had no names. Catherine remained catatonic. Morrison tried various interventions, smelling salts, cold water, even mild physical pain, but nothing penetrated whatever fortress she'd built in her mind. She existed in a state between living and dying, her body continuing to function while her consciousness had fled to someplace beyond reach. Daniel, for his part, became voluble once the initial shock wore off. He talked constantly, desperately, trying to explain or justify or simply discharge the guilt that was consuming him from the inside. He told Fletcher about the night Catherine had first mentioned him. It was last summer, August 1946. They'd been living in the hollow for just over a year. Catherine had been withdrawn, troubled, spending long hours alone while Daniel worked underground. He'd attributed it to the adjustment of living in such an isolated, difficult place. Then one night she'd woken him, shaking his shoulder insistently, her eyes wide and feverish. He spoke to me, she'd whispered, in my dreams. He told me about Sarah, about her purpose. Daniel had tried to calm her, had suggested she was overtired or suffering from the stress of their situation. But Catherine had been insistent. The voice was real. The message was clear. Sarah was special. Sarah had been chosen. Chosen for what? Daniel had asked. To receive him. To be his vessel when he returns. Daniel had dismissed it as religious delusion. They'd grown up in a church. Most people had. And he knew that poverty and hardship could make people grasp at spiritual explanations for their suffering. He'd assured Catherine that Sarah was fine, that God loved her in the normal way God loved all children, that there was no special purpose or destiny involved. But Catherine hadn't been satisfied with those reassurances. She'd started spending time in the root cellar, claiming she was organizing their limited food stores. Daniel hadn't questioned it. Everyone had their coping mechanisms, and if Catherine found comfort in imposing order on their preserved vegetables, who was he to judge? Then, in September, Catherine had discovered the cave passage. She'd been ecstatic, had seen it as a sign that her visions were real. The passage had been hidden behind a collapse of old potato sacks, invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. She'd found it by accident, or what she claimed was fate. She'd explored the caves and found the chamber. Found the chair. The chair was already there, Daniel told Fletcher, his voice taking on a pleading quality as if this detail somehow absolved him of responsibility. Catherine said it proved everything. Said the chair had been waiting for Sarah, that previous guardians had prepared the way. Previous guardians? Fletcher asked sharply. That's what she called them. Said Sarah wasn't the first. Said the ritual had been attempted before but never completed. Said that's why the hollow existed at all, because this place was marked special, a thin spot where he could cross over. Daniel had tried to argue with her, but Catherine had become increasingly volatile. She'd threatened to hurt herself if Daniel interfered. She'd threatened to hurt him. Eventually, she'd threatened to expose certain secrets from Daniel's past. Things from the war, things he'd done that he'd never told anyone about if he didn't cooperate. What things? Fletcher pressed. Daniel's face went gray. Things that would see me hanged. Things I'm not proud of but can't take back. Catherine knew about them somehow. She knew everything. It was like once he started speaking to her, she could see into people's souls. So Daniel had cooperated. Or at least he'd looked away. He'd let Catherine take Sarah into the caves. He'd ignored the crying, the screaming, the slow transformation of his daughter from a normal child into something broken and strange. He'd drunk himself to unconsciousness most nights to avoid thinking about it, and he'd told himself it would end. That Catherine would eventually realize her delusions weren't real, that no divine entity was coming to claim their daughter, that they could return to some semblance of normal family life. But it hadn't ended. It had only escalated. The ritual Catherine was performing, pieced together from her descriptions and the evidence in the caves, involved systematic breaking. Physical breaking, yes, but also psychological and spiritual breaking. The idea, as Catherine explained it to Daniel, was that Sarah needed to be made into an empty vessel. Her original self had to be destroyed to make room for him. The positions, Catherine forced Sarah into her design to replicate the drawings on the wall to transform Sarah's body into a shape that could receive an entity that didn't conform to human anatomy. The darkness, the isolation, the restraints, all of it was meant to strip away Sarah's resistance, her sense of self, her connection to the world of light and warmth and humanity. Catherine believed she was doing something holy, something necessary, something that would transform not just Sarah but the entire world. She kept saying it was almost complete, Daniel told Fletcher. That just a little more time, a little more preparation, and he would come. And then everyone would understand. Everyone would see that her visions were true. Do you believe that? Fletcher asked. Do you believe something was actually going to come? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't know what I believe anymore. But I know what I saw in Catherine's eyes. I know what I heard in Sarah's screams. If nothing else was real, the suffering was real. The evil was real. Whether it came from outside or from inside Catherine's mind doesn't change what she did. The county sheriff arrived 3 days after the discovery. Sheriff Thomas Hargrove was a man in his 50s who'd seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most things. But even he was visibly shaken by the Blackstone Hollow case. He interviewed witnesses, examined the evidence, descended into the caves himself to see the chambers where Catherine had conducted her rituals. He spent an hour reading Sarah's diary, his face growing progressively more disturbed with each page. When he emerged from the Blackwood house after his initial investigation, he gathered the Hollow's residents together. I've seen a lot in my years as sheriff, he told them, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. I've dealt with murders, with assaults, with every kind of crime humans can inflict on each other. But this is something different. This is something we may never fully understand. He paused, his gaze moving across the faces before him. Daniel Blackwood will be charged with child endangerment and accessory to assault. He'll stand trial in the county seat. Catherine Blackwood is currently not competent to stand trial, but if she recovers, she'll face charges of assault, child abuse, and attempted murder. What about Sarah? Elizabeth asked from the crowd. Hargrove's expression softened slightly. The girl is being transported to a hospital in Lexington tomorrow. Dr. Morrison has done all he can here, but she needs specialized care. I won't lie to you, her chances aren't good. Even if she survives physically, the psychological damage—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "And what about the rest of us?" This question came from Ray Harper. "What about everyone who knew something was wrong but didn't act fast enough?" "That's not for the law to decide," Hargrove said carefully. "You'll have to live with your own consciences on that count. But I will say this. Communities survive by looking after their own. When that fails, when people turn away from suffering because it's inconvenient or frightening or complicated, everyone bears some responsibility for what follows." The crowd was silent. "One more thing," Hargrove continued. "Those caves under the Blackwood house are being sealed. The company's sending men tomorrow to close up that passage permanently. Whatever was going on down there, it ends now. But sealing a passage doesn't seal away memory, doesn't undo what was done." Daniel Blackwood's trial took place in June 1947, less than a month after Sarah's discovery. The proceedings were swift. Daniel pled guilty to all charges, refusing to mount any defense. When asked by the judge if he had anything to say before sentencing, Daniel spoke for nearly an hour. He described Catherine's descent into delusion. He described his own cowardice and complicity. He described the sounds Sarah made as her body was systematically broken, night after night, in the caves beneath their house. And he described the final night, May 22nd, when Catherine had told him the ritual was complete. "She came up from the caves at midnight," Daniel told the court, his voice hollow. "She had Sarah with her, and Sarah was changed. I don't know how else to describe it. Her body was wrong in ways I can't explain. But she was alive, conscious even. And Catherine was triumphant. She said he was coming, said he would arrive before dawn, said everything we'd endured would be worth it. Did he come?" the prosecutor asked, though the question seemed almost ridiculous in the context of a courtroom. "No," Daniel said simply. "Dawn came and nothing happened." Sarah screamed, "That's what you all heard." And Catherine just stopped, like something inside her broke when she realized it was all for nothing. That she destroyed our daughter for a delusion. The judge sentenced Daniel Blackwood to 20 years in prison. He served 11 before dying of a heart attack in 1958. Catherine Blackwood never recovered from her catatonia. She was transferred to a state mental institution where she remained, unresponsive and unreachable, until her death in 1963. And Sarah? Sarah Blackwood survived. Against all medical predictions, against all reasonable expectations, she survived. She spent 2 years in the Lexington hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries to correct what could be corrected. Her bones were reset, her spine was stabilized. Her twisted limbs were gradually coaxed back towards something approaching normal function, but the psychological damage was beyond repair. Sarah never spoke again after that final mama on the night she was discovered. She existed in a state of profound withdrawal, locked inside whatever fortress of mind she'd built to survive her mother's rituals. In 1949, she was transferred to the same institution where Catherine was held. The two were kept in separate wings, some residual mercy in a system not known for mercy. Sarah died in 1997, at the age of 57. She spent 50 years in that institution. 50 years of silence. 50 years of whatever memories or nightmares lived behind her unseeing eyes. The story of Blackstone Hollow should have ended there. Daniel in prison, Catherine and Sarah in institutions, the caves sealed, the house eventually demolished by the company when it became clear no one would ever willingly live there again. But stories like this don't end. They echo, they transform into warnings, into legends, into the kind of thing parents tell children to illustrate the dangers of isolation and madness and unchecked belief. In the years following the Blackwood case, several peculiar things happened in and around Blackstone Hollow. First, there were the workers who sealed the cave passage. 4 men from the mining company were sent to fill the passage with concrete and rubble, to ensure no one could ever descend into those chambers again. They completed the job in 2 days, working efficiently, despite the disturbing drawings on the walls and the oppressive atmosphere of the space. But all 4 men reported the same strange experience. While working in the main chamber, they felt watched, not by each other but by something else, something that existed just beyond the range of their lantern light. observing their efforts with what could only be described as malevolent curiosity. One worker, a man named Thomas Keene, even claimed to see something briefly, a tall figure standing in the passage they'd used to enter, blocking the light from above. When Keene called out to it, thinking it might be a supervisor checking on their progress, the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there for several seconds before retreating up the passage. When Keene and his crew finished their work and ascended, they found no one waiting above. No supervisor had visited the site that day. Second, there was the matter of Elizabeth Garrison. Elizabeth, who had been the first to raise alarm about the Blackwoods, who had discovered Sarah's diary, who had descended into the caves and witnessed the evidence of Catherine's rituals. Elizabeth began experiencing nightmares shortly after the case concluded. In her dreams, she was in the cave chamber, sitting in that ancient chair, bound by the leather restraints, and standing before her, impossibly tall, was the figure from Catherine's wall drawings. She could never see it clearly. Her mind refused to process the full image, but she could feel its presence, its terrible patience, its hunger. The dreams occurred nightly for 3 months. Elizabeth told no one, bearing this burden as she'd borne so many others. She prayed. She read scripture. She tried every folk remedy for nightmares that the Hollow's older women could suggest. Nothing helped. Then, on September 15th, 1947, the dreams stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Elizabeth woke that morning feeling lighter, freed from some invisible weight she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. The nightmares never returned. She never discovered why they started or why they stopped. And eventually she filed the experience away with all the other mysteries that defined the Blackwood case. But she never forgot the figure's face, or rather, the place where a face should have been. That absence haunted her more than any feature could have. Third, there was the question of the chair. When the cave passage was sealed, the workers had been instructed to leave everything inside the chambers exactly as they'd found it. The chair, the altar, the drawings, all of it would be entombed, buried under tons of concrete and rubble, preserved forever in the darkness. But according to Thomas Keene's later testimony, given in 1973, 26 years after the events, when he was dying of lung cancer and wanted, he said, to clear his conscience, they hadn't left everything as they'd found it. The chair was gone. When the workers had entered the main chamber on the second day of sealing work, they'd discovered that the chair, that ancient, inexplicable piece of furniture that had no business existing in a natural cave system, had vanished. No signs of disturbance, no evidence it had been dragged away. It simply wasn't there anymore. The workers had discussed reporting this, but ultimately decided against it. They were tired, unsettled by the job, and eager to finish and leave. The disappearance of a piece of furniture seemed insignificant compared to the larger horrors the chamber represented. So they'd completed their work, sealed the passage, and never mentioned the missing chair in their official reports. Keene said he'd been troubled by this decision for decades. In his final weeks of life, morphine-addled and preparing for whatever judgment might await him, he'd felt compelled to reveal the truth. Something took that chair, he told the local minister who attended his deathbed. Something was in those caves with us, and it took the chair before we could seal it in, which means it got out. It's still out there somewhere. The minister, a young man named Robert Finch, dutifully recorded this confession, but he dismissed it as the delusions of a dying, drug-affected mind. The chair's disappearance, if it had even disappeared, surely had a rational explanation, didn't it? The Hollow itself changed after the Blackwood case. Families began leaving. First in a trickle, then in a steady stream. By 1950, only half the original residents remained. By 1955, the mine was operating at minimal capacity. The company, having determined that the coal veins in this particular location weren't worth the cost of extraction. In 1958, Blackstone Hollow was abandoned entirely. The company shut down operations, withdrew their equipment, and left the houses to decay. Within a decade, the hollow had been reclaimed by nature, roofs collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow, walls rotting from persistent moisture, floors buckling as the earth beneath them settled and shifted. Today, Blackstone Hollow is accessible only by a 4-mile hike from the nearest maintained road. The trail is poorly marked and dangerous in wet weather. Most people who know the hollow's history have no desire to visit. Those who don't know the history simply have no reason to make the difficult journey. But some do visit: urban explorers, paranormal investigators, historians documenting Appalachian mining culture. They occasionally make the trek, cameras and recording equipment in hand, looking for evidence of the tragedy or evidence of something stranger. And they report experiences, not all of them, not even most, but enough that a pattern has emerged over the decades. Voices in the ruins of the Blackwood house, speaking in languages that shouldn't exist, shadows that move independently of any light source. The persistent feeling of being watched, evaluated, measured against some incomprehensible standard, and occasionally, very rarely, visitors report seeing a chair. Not in the ruins. The chair is never found inside any structure. Instead, it appears in the forest surrounding the hollow, always in a different location, always sitting in small clearings, as if deliberately placed there for someone who hasn't yet arrived. Those who approach the chair describe feeling an overwhelming compulsion to sit in it. The compulsion is not irresistible. Several people have successfully walked away, but it takes effort. It takes will. And those who do sit in it, even briefly, report similar subsequent experiences. Dreams of the cave chamber. Dreams of the tall figure. Dreams of being prepared for something. Most shake off these dreams after a few nights, but some, a very few, find themselves drawn back to the hollow. They return again and again, hiking the difficult trail, searching for the chair, unable to articulate why they feel compelled to do so. One such person was Marcus Webb, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky, who visited the hollow in 2003 while researching his thesis on abandoned mining communities. Webb sat in the chair. He later told friends that he'd done it on a dare. He'd been hiking with two classmates, they'd found the chair, and they'd challenged each other to sit in it despite the creepy atmosphere of the location. Webb sat for perhaps 30 seconds before his friends convinced him to get up. But those 30 seconds were enough. Webb began having the dreams. He became obsessed with Catherine Blackwood's story, spending months researching court records, interviewing descendants of Blackstone Hollow families, trying to understand what Catherine had believed she was doing. In 2004, Webb disappeared. He'd told his roommate he was making another trip to the hollow, that he'd had a breakthrough in his understanding of Catherine's rituals, that he needed to see the location one more time to confirm his theories. He never returned. A search was conducted. Local authorities, volunteer searchers, even some police dogs. They found Webb's car at the trailhead, but no sign of Webb himself. The hollow was thoroughly searched. Nothing. Marcus Webb remains missing to this day. His case is officially unsolved, filed away with the hundreds of other people who disappear in Appalachian forests every year. Victims of accidents, exposure, wildlife, or simple disorientation in terrain that all looks the same. But those familiar with the Blackstone Hollow story wonder. They wonder if Webb found what he was looking for. If Catherine's delusions were somehow contagious. If the thing she'd tried to summon had indeed been summoned, just not in the way she'd expected. They wonder if Sarah Blackwood's 50 years of silence were not the result of psychological trauma, but rather the only rational response to knowledge no human mind was meant to carry. They wonder if the chair's disappearance from the sealed caves was an ending or a beginning. The truth about Blackstone Hollow, if truth is even the right word, is that we may never fully understand what happened there. We know the facts. We have Daniel's confession, Sarah's diary, the physical evidence of the caves and the altar, and the systematic abuse inflicted on a child by her own mother. We have medical records, trial transcripts, witness testimonies. We have the cold, documented reality of suffering, but the why remains elusive. Was Catherine Blackwood simply mentally ill, her delusions given shape and purpose by the isolation and hardship of hollow life? Was she a woman broken by poverty and loss, who created an elaborate fantasy to give meaning to her meaningless circumstances? Or was there something else? Something that spoke to her in dreams, that showed her visions of entities beyond human comprehension, that guided her hand as she drew those figures on cave walls? We want the answer to be mental illness. We want it to be explicable, containable, something that could have been prevented with proper psychiatric care and social support. We want it to be a cautionary tale about the importance of community mental health resources. But the lingering details refuse to fit neatly into that explanation. The chair that predated Catherine's rituals, that vanished from a sealed cave. The consistent reports of visitors who experienced similar visions and compulsions. The fact that Catherine's drawings, created in isolation with no access to historical or anthropological resources, bore striking similarity to symbols found in ancient cave art from completely different cultures, symbols associated with ceremonies we still don't fully understand. Sarah herself, who survived injuries that should have killed her multiple times over, who maintained some form of consciousness despite the systematic breaking of her body and mind. These details suggest possibilities we're uncomfortable entertaining. They suggest that maybe, just maybe, Catherine was responding to something real. Not real in the sense of physical, measurable reality, but real in some other sense. Real in the way that dreams are real, or trauma is real, or belief itself can become real through the intensity of its practice. The danger, of course, is that entertaining such possibilities can lead us down the same path Catherine followed, can transform us from observers trying to understand into participants trying to recreate, can turn intellectual curiosity into obsession, obsession into compulsion, compulsion into the kind of actions that destroy lives. This is the true horror of Blackstone Hollow. Not that Catherine Blackwood might have been insane, but that she might not have been. Not that she invented her visions, but that something actually did speak to her. Not that she failed in her ritual, but that she succeeded in ways we simply cannot perceive or measure. The most disturbing possibility is this, that Sarah did become a vessel for something, that the transformation Catherine sought did occur, and that Sarah's 50 years of silence were spent in communion with an entity we have no name for, no framework to understand, no way to protect ourselves against. If true, this would mean that Sarah's death in 1997 was not an ending but a release, that whatever lived inside, her, whether psychological construct or something, stranger was freed when her physical form finally gave out, and that it's still out there somewhere, still waiting, still patient, still hungry for the next vessel. The story of Blackstone Hollow remains a disturbing reminder that human capacity for cruelty knows no bounds, particularly when that cruelty is wrapped in the language of purpose, of divine mission, of preparation for something greater than ourselves. Catherine Blackwood believed she was serving a higher calling. She believed her suffering and Sarah's suffering would be vindicated by some cosmic revelation that would transform everything. In this belief, she was not unique. Throughout history, people have inflicted unspeakable harm on others while convinced they were doing necessary work. Holy work, important work. The difference between Catherine and, say, the architects of genocide or holy wars is merely one of scale, not kind. The psychological mechanism is identical. The ability to justify present harm with future salvation, to transform victims into necessary sacrifices, to reframe cruelty as kindness. But questions remain. Questions that haunt the descendants of Blackstone Hollow families, that trouble researchers who study the case, that keep people like me awake at night reconstructing events from fragmentary evidence. Was the chair truly ancient, or did Catherine construct it herself and use weathering techniques to make it appear old? The wood was never scientifically analyzed before the caves were sealed, so we'll never know. Did Marcus Webb truly disappear in the hollow, or did he simply choose to vanish from his old life, using the hollow's reputation as convenient cover? Missing persons cases are notoriously difficult to solve, and people disappear by choice more often than we'd like to believe. Are the visions reported by visitors to the hollow genuine paranormal experiences, or simply the psychological power of suggestion acting on minds primed by knowledge of the tragedy? Our brains are remarkably good at creating experiences that match our expectations. These questions have no definitive answers, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some depths are meant to stay unplumbed. To this day, the ruins of Blackstone Hollow stand empty and decaying, slowly being consumed by the forest that surrounds them. The cave passage beneath the former Blackwood house remains sealed, though erosion and time will eventually breach even that barrier. The hollow itself has become a place people speak of in whispers, a name invoked to frighten children or illustrate the dangers of isolation. And on silent nights, when the wind moves through those abandoned structures with sounds like breathing, when the creek runs black under starlight, when the mountains press in from all sides like cupped hands holding secrets too terrible to release, on those nights, local residents report hearing things: a child crying, low muttered prayers in a language no one recognizes, the scraping of furniture being moved in houses long since collapsed. Most dismiss these reports as auditory pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in random noise, to hear meaning in the meaningless sounds of nature. And they're probably right. Probably. But if you ever find yourself in eastern Kentucky, hiking the ridges above abandoned mining settlements, and you come across a trail that leads down into a narrow valley where sunlight seems reluctant to penetrate, a place where the trees grow at wrong angles, and the creek runs dark even on the brightest days, you might want to turn back. And if you're foolish enough to continue, if curiosity or academic interest or simple stubbornness compels you forward into that hollow where houses rot and memories fester, and if you should happen to find a chair sitting alone in a clearing, ancient wood gone gray as bone, leather restraints dangling like waiting arms, do not sit in it. Do not touch it. Do not acknowledge it in any way. Simply turn around and leave, and do not look back, no matter what sounds you hear. Behind you, some invitations should never be accepted. Some preparations should never be completed. Some vessels should remain forever empty. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest mysteries has moved you, if you find yourself contemplating the thin line between devotion and delusion, between faith and madness, between the explicable and the eternal unknown, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Histories buried beneath official narratives. Mysteries that deserve examination even when that examination provides no comfort. Only questions. Leave a like if this account of Blackstone Hollow has provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment. If it's reminded you that the past is never truly past, that suffering echoes across generations, that some horrors are too profound to be neatly categorized or easily dismissed. And in the comments, share your thoughts on this question. When does faith become delusion? When does preparation for the divine become simple cruelty? Where is the line between genuine spiritual experience and psychological break, and who gets to decide which side of that line a person falls on? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary questions. Until next time, remember that history is written by those brave enough to look unflinchingly at what we'd rather forget, and that sometimes the most important truths are the ones we're most afraid to speak aloud.